Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Alok Pattani. Alok, thank you very much for joining me. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter @bettingpod and check out the website businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Alok Pattani. Alok, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So, look, you're not a typical sports bettor, bookmaker, or someone that I've spoken to in the past, however, equally as fascinating. Why don't you start with what you're currently doing and some of the things you've done recently?
Yeah, I'm a data scientist here at Google at the headquarters in Mountain View. Prior to that, I worked at ESPN for 8 years full-time, and most of that time was spent working in sports analytics. So I'm a big sports fan. Background is statistics degree. Wanted to, always good at math, always liked sports. Didn't really know how to combine them till college, which is right around the time when the sports analytics movement started to gain a little bit of footing with Moneyball, of course, in the U.S., and Basketball on Paper, which was a more technical book from Dean Oliver, but that really kind of spurred the basketball movement. And I was like, oh, this sounds like a really fun thing to be involved in. So I tried to angle myself into there. Got fortunate with ESPN, starting a sports analytics team shortly after I had joined, had the right background, and things kind of took off from there.
So the reason I'm so interested in talking to you, I've heard you speak publicly about what you've done at ESPN and done in the past, and obviously now at Google. That's certainly not a step down. I guess from my perspective, 8 or 10 years ago when you were starting out in sports analytics, what was it like back then? What type of data sets were you playing around with? What type of information did you have at your fingertips?
I think a lot sort of less granular information than we have now. So in the first sort of stab I think I took at sports analytics, I was still in college at Boston University, and I had done this independent study working on NBA data. And at the time, there was some stuff publicly available, and I was able to get my hands on it, but it was season level data. And if I really worked, maybe I would have had game level data. So the questions we were asking were the highest level, how do teams win, and what correlates with winning within a season. And it wasn't even that predictive at the time that I was asking the question. And then when we started at ESPN, we actually had a lot of data, but people hadn't looked at it in sort of this analytical framework. It was more we have play-by-play data and we surface it right to the website, right? So, or, to people just to know what's going on in the game. But, eventually you can start thinking about the play-by-play data gives you such a rich source of, how players contribute to teams' chances of winning. And those are the types of questions we eventually started asking. But at the time, it was set up just to kind of we want the play-by-play data to come in and then get to the fans.
So a lot of people listening are probably thinking, are you a professional sports bettor? How does sports betting fit into this, given it's a betting podcast? Just to clear the air out, from the very beginning, you're not actively or at all involved in sports betting. That's fair to say, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and I think it's still interesting from many aspects, given you've worked in the heart of things at ESPN and building a sports analytics sort of team and department and working out what's predictive, why, being a data scientist at ESPN or even Google now. So that's the sort of angle I want to touch on. So take us back to the starting days at ESPN. What was your role back then and how did it evolve?
So the idea was to, we were within a content group at ESPN known as the Stats and Information Group, which continues to put out really good, interesting information about all sorts of sports going on. ESPN covers, all the sports across the world. So when we started the analytics team, it was a group of 3 or 4 of us, and we It wasn't exactly like we knew we would come up with a couple projects and then eventually things would kind of go one way, over time, depending on how well we did and what kind of stuck with the rest of the company. So the first project we started on was called QBR, the total quarterback rating, and that was to rate NFL quarterbacks on their performance. There was ways that this has been done for years and years, and we thought, well, again, with that play-by-play data, and we had player tracking data. Sorry, I shouldn't say player tracking data. It was video track data of additional information. So again, this is like 2010. This is before you had the sensors and stuff. But we had people at ESPN watching every play of every NFL game and charting additional information that isn't in the play-by-play. And we were thinking that if we put that all together, we could build a better quarterback rating system, took into account the context of every play, divided credit, and did some other things at the end to kind of put it in this meaningful scale. And that was our first project we worked on for, I would say, like 6 or 8 months. We had a big launch, and then we continued to work on that, but that was the one that got us off the ground. From there, we did a bunch of different things. College basketball was something I was involved in. College football was something I was very involved in for a few years. The team grew, so the team itself then got more involved in NFL predictions, NBA predictions, and towards the end of my time, and I think has continued since I left, I've been more involved in college basketball predictions, soccer, all sorts of things. So we didn't start with this sort of like predictive, like we're just going to build predictive models, but eventually it became kind of apparent that it would be really useful for lots of cases. And I think myself and then the team over time grew in our capabilities to do more predictive modeling.
I want to get to the college football Power Index and a few other things you've done. Before we get there, tell me the first time, if you can remember, when the betting line was discussed or the spread was discussed or something from the betting markets or information from the betting markets was thought about to be used within, evaluating performance or evaluating anything, whether it's a performance or even predictions.
Yeah, good question. So when I kind of came into sports. I'm a fan. I watched a lot of different sports, and in particular basketball and American football. But I didn't gamble much. I think I understood what the line was. Like I knew what -4 meant, but I didn't get it, and I didn't quite understand why anyone who was not betting would use the betting line. So again, this is years ago. I was pretty naive. And over time, through working at ESPN, and there are people who were very much into understanding the lines, and in some cases, obviously more now, but even at the time, there were some sort of niche products where the people would talk about the gambling side of football games or what have you. So it was an education process for me, but what I realized was the line ends up being a really good gold standard to evaluate your predictions by. So if you're going to make game predictions in any sport, but we were starting, let's say, with college football. You wanted to have good game predictions. Well, what does that mean? You want to get them right, of course, but now we need to compare to other systems. And if you study over the course of many years, the system that does the best, if you count it as a system, is the closing line, or some sort of line that's set by Vegas, and that's because the market is fairly efficient. They have the most information, all the things that most of your listeners probably are aware of. But at the time, this was not something that was obvious to me. So we didn't sort of incorporate the betting line into predictions, but we started realizing if we are going to have a predictive model, we need to compare ourselves to the betting line and see how well we're doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess going back to the CFB Power Index, when you're building that, did you utilize or include anything from the betting markets or any information related?
Yeah, we didn't explicitly, at the time I was involved at the beginning and sort of the first few iterations of it, we didn't explicitly use any of the gambling information or preseason odds or anything like that. I think college football has actually come a good bit in the last 4 or 5 years. But at the time, there were a few rating systems, but we were we thought that we had the best play-by-play data, or at least the most clean play-by-play data, so we could do a lot of work with that. And we actually, this is probably similar to other people who built models, but what we were doing is we would use some combination of data we could gather from the preseason and then ratings from previous season college football. very short season, right? So most teams will play like 12 or 13 games and maybe a little more if they get into the bowls and playoffs. But so you don't have a ton of data in a given season. So the preseason rating actually matters for like a good bit of your predictions. So if we could go past seasons and build a good rating for each team going into the season, we knew that would be really important in terms of doing our predictions from the beginning onward. So it was actually a little bit more of like a traditional, like gather a bunch of data, including stuff that would be available before a season, do some modeling, and then sort of iteratively work on the model. And then like once we had that, we could like do game predictions and then, back test versus Vegas lines and things like that.
So this might be a dumb question, but what, as you set out to build a power index, let's say, or any other predictive model, I guess what's the intention, or what's the one or two things that you've got in mind from the outset?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. So like, what's the goal of your predictive model? So if I'm, others on your podcast are professional gamblers and if let's say they're focused on specific games, then the goal of their model is to make sure that game prediction is right. And that was one part of the goal at ESPN, but remember the idea is to serve like content, right? So content means TV, it means like ESPN.com and Twitter and all these other places where ESPN puts its content. So initially we were just going to like rate teams. So it'd be like, here's team 1 and here's team whatever, 128 if it's college football, 32, and you just can like have some rating. And we found out like that is useful, but only like part of the way there. What does it mean if one team is 1 and one team is 10 and they're playing each other and 10 is at home or something? So there you have to make a game prediction model. So, you do that, but then like the question is, well, who's going to win the Super Bowl or who's going to win this series in the NBA playoffs? So now you're turning from your game predictions into series, season-long predictions. So eventually, like those became the goal. If we were building a soccer model for like the World Cup, for example, we would want to like have something at the beginning of the World Cup, and then it would move throughout the World Cup, and we can track the team's chances as teams advance through the group stage and then the knockout stage. So eventually, I think those sort of season projections became very interesting and maybe among the most interesting outputs. So we had to have a predictive model that was like good at rating the teams, to a game prediction or match prediction model that was good at predicting the matches, to then building up to those season projections, which could then be used all over the place. And in fact, like were and still are for ESPN, they can make really good use of that information both leading up to a season and within a season.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess one component that's obviously everyone wants to, in the sports betting world, build a predictive model and then bet based on that. Have you thought about the difference between the performance analysis and how that might be useful, or is it useful when you're talking about predicting a team's performance?
Yeah, I think the best example I can talk to on this is the American football perspective. So we had this quarterback rating system that we started with, and again, that was kind of in a non-predictive sense. We kind of just wanted a way to score a quarterback's performance. They played a game or the season, and sort of who rated as the best quarterback based on everything they did to contribute to winning. And of course, that has like some of similar elements as prediction, but it's not the same thing. You're not necessarily stripping out all the sort of randomness to just get at the part that's going to correlate most going forward. You may not have the aging curves and all these things built in. So when we went to build the first version of the NFL Football Power Index and the projections there, we knew that taking into account the quarterback was going to be really significant, and like the stakeholders we had at ESPN were like, we can't have a system where if one of the top quarterbacks goes down, the projection does not update. So what the team built at that time was to take QBR and build a little bit more of a predictive version of that. So that would take into account the age and strip out a little bit of the randomness, and that was going to at least give some version of if this quarterback starts for the team versus that quarterback, their chances of win will adjust in up or down by this much. And you can imagine really good quarterback like Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady, the difference between him and his backup was much bigger than sort of these teams where the starter is not very good and maybe the backup's going to come in anyways because he gets benched throughout the season. So we wanted to take that into account. So this was how in the NFL case is we ended up having you'd have a rating for the team with its starting quarterback and then with its backup. And then once we got some sort of news on injuries or suspensions or what have you, we can adjust the team's rating accordingly, and it would be adjusted sort of dynamically looking forward. So if this quarterback, the big case we had initially was Tom Brady was suspended for four games to start a season. We can say okay, adjust the Patriots projection such that he's going to be out for 4 games, but then he'll be back for the 5th game. And then, that obviously affects those game predictions, but also their chances to win the division and make it through the playoffs. So we had some way to dynamically update that whole thing.
So one part of that, and it's probably not even your job, but I'm sure you've dealt with it. How do you deal with someone that says, well, that's completely ridiculous? And maybe one example is when you see the power index or the percentage chance of winning, and it's 99.9%, and then that team goes to lose. How do you balance knowing what the data says, and maybe it truly is a 99.9% chance of winning, and then that doesn't happen? How do you talk to people in those instances when well, the data says this, but the human element and the counterintuitive aspect is there?
Really good question. We had lots of difficulties in the past on this sort of thing. And so within game win probability is a tricky place for this. And that was something that our team was working on. And I think they continue to. I think there's there's 2 answers on the within game. If you have a 99.9% chance of winning and the team lost, I think the Super Bowl with the Patriots, not the one you referenced against the Seahawks, but the one with the Falcons where they were down 28-3, is a good example of this. Where I think there's two things that were at play. One is maybe the chance wasn't 99.9, right? Maybe the model is wrong, and it should be, if you take into account all the factors, maybe it was something like 98 or 97. I don't know. So one is maybe the model should handle that better. The other factor is it's still pretty close, right? In sort of the linear scale where no matter how good you think the Patriots are and how likely you thought the comeback was, I don't think you thought it was very likely to happen, such that the percentage adjustment you would make is pretty small. So I think you can acknowledge that the model could be better while also still being it's not that far off. It's still really unlikely for these comebacks to happen. And then the reason why it feels that way to fans or maybe others is because the other if that game was 28-3 and the Falcons go on to win 35-17 or something, we aren't talking about the fact that they had a 99.9% chance to win because they ended up winning. So you have all these times in uninteresting games where that leads to a win for that team, and those don't get discussed. The comebacks are the most exciting ones. So from the the media perspective, that's what gets discussed. So often you'll see commentator say oh, it had a 95% chance to win, and then they'll show the highlight and that team loses, and they'll say, see, that didn't mean anything. Well, yeah, it's because we didn't show the other 19 highlights where the team with the 95% chance to win went on to win, because it's not as exciting. So you have this sort of bias in terms of what gets presented from the win probability. The one way we combat that is if you kind of look back. We did this a lot with the game predictions where, a team had a 75% chance to win. They lost the game. But if you look at all the games where we said a team had a 75% chance to win, roughly 3 out of 4 times they won the game, and that's how you calibrate a model. Some people bought that. It's harder with others who aren't necessarily thinking probabilistically, but over time you can kind of, use some data and some key examples of those to say this is, how we track our system.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably going to exist for a lot longer than we will. I think one of the
The Betfair Exchange isn't a house that sets the odds. It's betting at its purest. One punter's opinion against another's. Play the game within the game at betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
One of the interesting aspects I find talking to a lot of people in this space is they don't want to use data, they don't want to use models, either because they don't agree with it or understand it or have the time or the expertise to do it. If you were on the side of someone who says data scientists are irrelevant, models are stupid, they're not predictive, you see the 99.9% thing in the Super Bowl, they don't make any sense, what arguments would you use, or what can you use to try and say that there's limits on the extent the data can be correct, or there's limits to the extent models can work, is there any reasonable arguments left, or are we in an age now where if you don't do it and you use intuition and a lot of the cognitive biases we know about now, you're going to fall behind?
Yeah, I don't think there's like only intuition and gut feeling will work in sort of a sustainable way. So you can probably think of like cases. So like maybe games or in-game win probability isn't the best example here, but when you have a case where like, so some team executives in American sports or maybe otherwise, a lot of them are not necessarily data driven at this point, right? So they go into a draft and they maybe have some data or some information from others on their staff who provide data, but they make picks, a lot of cases off of some sort of a lot of information which you get from scouting and that sort of stuff. And I think those picks, like if you look backwards, they probably do not much worse than picks that were strictly based on numbers, because the old school piece still plays a big role there. So I think they can have some argument that, my picks are good, and you also have a smaller sample. You're only making a couple picks, draft picks a year or transactions a year. I still think data can help you there, but my point is I think those people can have some sort of argument that this will work. I think when you have these like large scale, like I'm going to bet on lots of games over the course of a year, I'm going to try to track win probabilities in every game or every match. I don't think a pure gut feel approach will work. I do think that it's important to listen to those people at the time. So if like we go back to our Super Bowl example, it's down, Patriots are down 28-3. The model says 99.9%, and some like intelligent football person says, no, there's no way that's right. They have Tom Brady. I think at least it would be higher than that, higher than a 0.1% chance for the Patriots. They may be relevant, right? So like what they're saying could actually be that, you need to take into account this. And then you, as sort of the analyst, data scientist, statistician person, can say, oh, what I need to do is adjust my model to take into account the fact that, whatever the case may be, whatever, maybe, if you know your model, you'll know what may not be represented well. And then maybe in the off season or the next season, you can adjust it. And again, it's not going to make it 50-50 at that point, but it might move the probabilities a little bit, and you're actually gaining intuition from that person.
Yeah, that's another question I had around that was, how is that going to evolve? Because, in those instances, or as we move forward, people are going to use a lot more data-driven models or data-driven employees that will help push or trend things in those ways. And one example, I heard a Malcolm Gladwell podcast recently about pulling the goalie. I think it was 11 and a half minutes out if you're down by 1 or 2 goals in a hockey game.
Yeah.
No one is going to do that for many reasons. But even if that is optimal, and I don't know, but if it is, people might pull the goalie, 1 minute out, and then maybe 1.5 minutes and 2 minutes. And as it trends towards what the data scientists tell the head coaches that is optimal, how do you factor in getting, I guess, the model right, the intuition, and then obviously the public backlash that goes into these type of things? Can you reasonably factor in those things when, as a data scientist, do you think about them and can you include them?
Yeah, so I think that's a very multi-layered question. I think there's a couple things there that I think you can factor in. So from like the sort of backlash and coaching, and I think there is where you have this like sort of the incentives of a team, sort of how do they align from player to coach to general manager to owner, right? So if everyone is kind of on the same page, right, then and they believe the data, let's say, then like a coach can make a really like seemingly crazy decision, and maybe it won't work, but in the long term, it knows it increases our chances of winning, maybe small, like 5% or something, but over many decisions that adds up. And then you have, the GM who has discussed that with the coach, and the owner who's sort of on board with that, and the coach isn't fearing that, like, based on the media backlash, he might get fired or something afterwards. I think you have the ability to take more risks like that. There's a couple examples of this in American sports. I think the football one is the Eagles. They were very aggressive on fourth down. Sort of the football analytics community for the last 15, maybe more years has been suggesting that NFL teams should be much more aggressive about going forward on fourth down versus punting the ball away. The Eagles actually kind of put this into play a lot last year, helped them win, had a couple key plays in the Super Bowl that actually were fourth downs. So I think they were at least like aligned enough to try it, and it worked. And now, whether this is now the right thing or not, I think other teams will look at that and say, oh, we can do this too. And maybe they should have been doing it all along, but now you have these sort of like really big, high profile example use cases of where it did work. And then that can play a role. To your other question about like data science and like the decision making without it, I think you're going to have more and more data, that's for sure. So I think the trick there is, even with the new techniques and stuff, asking the right questions is still like the most important thing, I think. So with all the data, you have, your data scientist has some sports experience, but hopefully you're working in concert with the coach or general manager, others on the staff who have lots of experience, and they might indicate to you what are the right questions to ask. And then you might go off and do a lot of work to help answer those questions. But if they tell you which questions to ask, and then you kind of go about it the right way, you're gaining information from the sort of old school people, but also helping your analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that's caught up to maybe a 50-50 recognition of that? Obviously, if you went back to spoke to Bear Bryant about what he was using from data and analytics, he probably might say nothing. Do you think it's still? Yep. I don't think niche is the right word. I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago you could still argue it was niche, but even now, especially with the Eagles, especially with some of the other approaches, even in baseball, obviously, do you think we're 50-50 in terms of intuition and data and modeling, or we're still got a fair way to go to catch up?
I think it's a fair way to go. Maybe in baseball it's closer to the split you suggest. I know in the NBA, there's been huge progress in the last 10 years, since I've been sort of aware of these things by going to the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. It used to be a couple teams had one person doing analytics, then it was everyone has 1 or 2 people, and now it's some teams have a huge staff of this. I still am not sure how much that gets into decision making. I know of certain cases, and I'm always kind of the pro data guy. I'm going to look for the cases where that does work out. Houston Rockets. I just talked about the Eagles in that sense, but I imagine there's lots of cases where there may be a large presence, but how much it gets incorporated into decision making, I don't know, and it may not be as much as it appears yet. So I think it differs a lot by sport. I think we're a good ways from where the data is sort of relied upon as heavily as that.
So how far do you think we have in terms of data scientists and analytics, certainly in sports, and then obviously for the listeners applying that to betting and using those same techniques to find predictive models? Are we at the tip of the sword, or have we got a long, long way to go? Or once we get access, widespread public access to player tracking data, that'll revolutionize things? Or maybe one day there'll be biometric data that's available on, athletes, and that'll revolutionize things. Yeah. What sort of transition do you see in the future? Because I'm always curious to understand from those who are on the front line if we're at the tip of the sword now, or looking back in 5 or 10 years, we're going to laugh at talking about play-by-play data and maybe some tracking.
Yeah, I think it'll be a little bit of both. We might laugh at it somewhat, but these things take a while to kind of put into play. So just because you have a lot of data doesn't mean, again, that you're answering all the right questions. So if I have a bunch of player tracking data or maybe biometric data, it's going to take a while, even within a team or from a gambling perspective, I think, to understand what am I going to do with that data to improve what I'm currently doing. So if you're a professional sports gambler, you have some models, ones who are based on data, you have some models, and you're already probably predicting games or season outcomes with some degree of accuracy. And then, of course, there's some limit to that accuracy because of randomness in sports, and the best team doesn't always win, and all these sorts of things. So how close you can get to that with the new data, I think is something you can measure, but I don't think it's going to sports aren't going to be completely deterministic, I don't think. So you're not going to have I'm going to start predicting games at a 95% rate, for example. So I think it'll come down a lot to the new data and how you ask the right questions to incorporate it. I think from the betting standpoint, from what I can tell, the markets are pretty efficient. Maybe 10 years ago, in certain cases, it wasn't the case for bigger sports. So, it's not clear to me that you can get the new data and then start beating the market in a sustainable way. but professional gamblers might disagree with me.
No, certainly in NFL, I would definitely agree with you. There may be small edges to be had, but we'll see how that evolves. One question I often talk to people about is how to build a model. And as a non-Google data scientist, or without 8 years at ESPN behind me or anyone else, how would you suggest someone like that go about building maybe a spreadsheet model or anything like that? What are some of the pillars that are important to consider?
Yeah, I think the trial and error method is however you go about it, I think is the best way. So like, this is going to be cliche, but like getting your hands dirty and actually doing it and then seeing what happens and then doing it again and seeing what happens is going to be, I think, the best teacher. So what I think is really valuable in the last couple of years since I left ESPN and now I'm at Google, what I find crazy is the data science community sort of online, on Twitter, all these places has really like gotten big. And you can find really good like tutorials on how to use Python, how to use R, how to use SQL, all these like programming languages that people use for data science, sports or otherwise. And you can find then applications to whatever your use case may be. So how do I use R to build like a basketball model using some of the spatial tracking data, like the little bit that's been released publicly, and build like a simple like little animation that shows all the players in the court. So there's some web source that shows you that, and it might take a while to like go through it and understand it, and maybe I don't even understand the first part of it, so then I have to go and like learn about some package or something in R. But it's there for you to kind of like learn. So I think you have a ton of resources online. You have communities like Kaggle, which is like a community of machine learning data scientists, and they work on all these prediction problems for money in some cases. And, I think they provide you the data too. So like now you don't have to necessarily go gather the data. They provide you the data. They have some ways you can go in and like play around and do some basic modeling. So I think Excel spreadsheet model, maybe a good starting point. I think getting into programming is nowadays becoming more and more relevant and important. And I think this is like, if you're really interested in sports and want to do sports gambling, I think that's a really good way to like force yourself to learn programming if you don't, if you only know a little bit or don't know it at all.
Okay. And besides programming, for those that are interested in sports betting and read through stats and go through a lot of information and want to try and build their own system or model or whatever it might be, or just want to work in sports and that type of thing, any material or content or books? You mentioned some tutorials online. Is there anything else in that space that's relevant or has helped you throughout your time at ESPN or otherwise?
Yeah, so many. So I think the starting point for me for basketball was certainly Basketball on Paper by Dean Oliver. Dean Oliver, I was fortunate enough to work with at ESPN for a few years. He's sort of the pioneer of basketball analytics, at least from like the NBA perspective. And that's a really good like foundational book. It's about 15-ish years old now, which is, but it still has a lot of like concepts of possessions and tracking and how you like evaluate a player in the context of a team and that sort of thing. For football, I spent a lot of time reading the Advanced Football Analytics blog by Brian Burke, who also had the fortune of working with at ESPN. But I had actually been in contact with him many years prior to that, learning about his like take on NFL and just expected points and all these sorts of concepts that are really fundamental to football analytics. And there's those are both places where there's tons of material and like you can go from start to finish and really like build up your knowledge base. And then, I think there's all sorts of online resources that I couldn't enumerate. Those are the two that helped me get started. There may be better ones for nowadays, like getting started, where you don't have to you have much more data and you can just start sort of ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Look, thank you very much for your time. It was a little different area for me, but I thoroughly enjoyed chatting and I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. This was a good time. Appreciate you having me.